They dragged her into the cantina by the wrist, and not one man in that room stood up. Watch what happens next, because before this story ends, a whole town will have to decide whether silence makes them just as guilty as the monster holding the whip. The Sonora sun does not forgive sinners, and it forgives the forgotten even less. Inside the cantina, the light came in broken pieces, slicing through the dust and spilled mezcal, falling on faces that refused to look up. In the middle of that room, a mountain of a man had his fingers locked around the arm of a young Apache woman, and he was smiling the way men smile when they have never once been told no. His name was Rodrigo, and he owned most of the land for 50 miles in every direction. He was a man who had convinced himself that God had personally handed him the right to behave like a devil. His face was flushed red with whiskey and rage. A mask of arrogance stretched over something smaller and more frightened underneath, the kind of man who needed a crowd to watch him win. The woman was Nayeli. Her clothes were leather and beadwork, a quiet reminder that this land had owners long before European steel ever touched it. "Sign the paper," Rodrigo roared, his voice slamming off the adobe walls like thunder. He shoved a crumpled document toward her. Nayeli spat on the floor. It was worth more than 1,000 words. "That land belongs to my people by royal decree and by ancestral right," she said, and her voice did not shake. "Your maps are lies, Rodrigo. Scribbles from a man too afraid of the truth to face it." From the doorway, silver spurs began to ring against the wooden floor. If you're enjoying how this story unfolds, do me a quick favor and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. Now back to San Judas. The stranger walked in slow, unhurried, each step landing with a weight that seemed to press the tension right out of the air. Rodrigo spun around, momentarily loosening his grip on Nayeli, startled that anyone would dare interrupt his little kingdom. "Get out of here, stranger," Rodrigo warned, his hand drifting toward the whip on his belt. "This isn't your business, and in San Judas, curious men end up feeding the buzzards." The cowboy said nothing. His silence was more insulting than any words could have been. He pulled off his hat and set it on the bar, revealing a face carved by experience and loss, eyes that had been forged by something Rodrigo would recognize far too late. "Water," the cowboy said, his voice low, like it came from somewhere deep underground. A voice that had never once been afraid. The bartender's hands shook as he poured. Rodrigo, feeling ignored in a world where he was used to being worshipped, took that as a mortal sin, one paid for in blood. He crossed the room and dropped a heavy, sweating hand on the stranger's shoulder. "I told you to get lost, animal," Rodrigo growled, his breath reeking of mezcal and self-importance. The cowboy looked at the hand on his shoulder like it was an insect that had landed there by mistake. Then he looked up, straight into Rodrigo's eyes, a gaze that had seen battlefields and unmarked graves. "Take your hand off me," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a sentence already written. Rodrigo laughed, glancing toward his men at the door for approval. "Or what, farm rat? You gonna get your blood on my boots?" What happened next moved too fast for the eye to follow. The stranger seized Rodrigo's wrist, twisted it, and forced him to let go of Nayeli. Rodrigo staggered back with a shout, but before he hit the ground, he signaled toward the door. His two men drew their pistols. One fired first. The bullet clipped the edge of the bar, sending splinters flying past the stranger's face. One caught his cheek. A shallow cut, but enough to prove that even the fastest men still bleed. Mateo answered with 2 shots, clean and precise. One gunman dropped, wounded. The other lost his weapon and collapsed against a table. For the first time, real fear crossed Rodrigo's face. Gunsmoke hung in the room like a gray veil. When the silence returned, it wasn't the silence of terror anymore. It was the silence of people watching something they hadn't believed was possible. The cowboy released Rodrigo's wrist, the way a man drops something he no longer wants to touch. He turned to Nayeli, his face softening for just a moment. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice had become a place to rest. She nodded, though her chest still rose and fell hard, the aftershock of someone who had just slipped out of death's grip. "He's been trying to force me to hand over the title deeds to the mission and the communal lands," she explained. "He's spent years forging land grants and driving out families who have no way to fight back." What she was about to reveal was more dangerous than any gun in that cantina, because those papers wouldn't just destroy Rodrigo. They could implicate judges, soldiers, and officials across the entire province. "He's been forging land titles for years, using the chaos of the wars in Europe as cover," she said. Rodrigo, groaning on the floor like the coward he had always been underneath the mask, reached for a hidden knife in his boot. The stranger simply stepped on his hand, the silver of his spur catching the light like something almost vengeful. "Stay down," the cowboy said, and his voice carried the weight of a mountain. Nayeli walked to the table where Rodrigo had left his papers, the same documents that had shackled her people. She pulled a small leather pouch from beneath her clothes, a secret she had carried at the cost of her own safety, and drew out an old ledger and a yellowed map bearing the seal of the earliest viceroys. "I have spent months in this man's house, working as a servant, invisible enough that he showed me exactly who he really is," she told the room. "I watched him erase the names of the true landowners. I watched him order the church records burned so no family could ever prove their inheritance." A murmur spread through the crowd. The spell of fear was cracking under the weight of the truth. Nayeli held up a letter bearing the royal seal of Spain, a document Rodrigo should never have had in his possession. "This letter orders a full review of every land grant in the valley. It was sent from Mexico City under the authority of the viceroy, but Rodrigo intercepted it before it ever reached the magistrate. This proves that the Valley of San Judas is communal property, and that Rodrigo is a traitor to the crown and to his own people." The cowboy looked at her with something close to reverence. This wasn't a woman who needed saving. She was a strategist, a warrior who used truth and law as her sharpest arrows. Rodrigo tried to speak, tried to stammer out some kind of defense, but only managed a mouthful of blood and bitter spit. "You all knew this deep down," Nayeli said, turning to face the townspeople, her words cutting like obsidian. "You knew your comfort was built on the bones of my ancestors and the hunger of your own children." The old farmer, the same man who had crushed his glass in his fist, rose to his feet with a dignity he hadn't felt in years. "She's right," he said, his voice shaking at first, then gaining strength with every word. "They killed my brother over an acre of land he swore was his. I stayed quiet because I was scared of ending up the same way." One by one, other men stood up, their faces lit with a long-buried anger finally allowed to surface. Rodrigo's authority crumbled like a sandcastle under a rising tide. The cowboy leaned against the bar, watching the town find its spine again. "What do you want to do with him?" Nayeli asked him, recognizing that the real authority in that room now belonged to her. She looked down at the giant on the floor, the man who a moment ago had believed himself untouchable. "Justice," she said with perfect clarity, "not revenge. Revenge would make us no better than him. Take him to the district judge in Chihuahua, where the evidence can't simply disappear. I have everything needed to make sure he spends the rest of his life in a cell." The men of the town, now armed with a courage that had been stolen from them for years, surrounded Rodrigo. They hauled him up roughly, stripping him of his silk jacket and whatever false honor he had left, and dragged him out to the same cargo cart he had once used to haul away the fruits of other people's labor. The sun began to set, painting the Sonora Desert in orange, purple, and something that looked almost like redemption. Nayeli stepped out into the street, the stranger walking beside her, the man who had become the spark of her freedom. The air felt cooler now, as if the land itself had exhaled. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice soft but genuinely curious. The man was quiet for a moment, looking toward the horizon where the first stars were appearing. "Mateo," he finally said, saying a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Why did you stop, Mateo? You could have kept riding, forgotten all of this." I don't like watching big men hurt small ones, he answered simply, with the logic of someone who had seen far too much injustice already. And I like the way you fought for what was yours. You showed more courage than every man who looked away in that cantina. Nayeli smiled for the first time in longer than she could remember, a smile that lit up her tired face and gave her back some of her youth. It erased the dirt, the scars, all of it, at least for a moment. I'm Nayeli, she said, offering a hand that no longer trembled. My people owe you more than a glass of water, and a thank you. Mateo adjusted his horse's cinch, preparing for a departure that maybe wasn't going to happen after all. You don't owe me anything. Dignity isn't for sale. But maybe I'll stay a couple of days, just to make sure that letter reaches Chihuahua safely. Nayeli stepped closer, closing the distance the desert usually forces between strangers. There was a spark in her eyes now. That wasn't gratitude, and wasn't fear either. The Sonora Desert is vast, and it doesn't forgive mistakes, she said quietly. It's better not to cross it alone when the truth is your only luggage. Mateo studied her, searching her eyes for a reason to stop being a man with no place to belong. He saw in her a strength rarely found in any city, an integrity that outweighed any noble title, an intelligence sharp enough to have outmaneuvered the most powerful man in the region with nothing but will and paperwork. Maybe you're right, he admitted, allowing himself, for the first time in a decade, to imagine a future. They walked together down the main street of San Judas, under the rising silver moonlight. The dust was still there, but everything else felt different. There was a charge in the air, something electric, a fragrance of hope blooming between the cactus and the dark. Mateo knew his past was heavy, a trail of decisions that hunted him like wolves in the night. He had been a soldier for the crown who deserted the moment he was ordered to slaughter unarmed villagers. It was a wound that no amount of water could wash clean. Only acts of present courage could begin to answer for it. But under that enormous Sonora sky, for the first time, he felt like his search for redemption might finally find a harbor. Nayeli told him about her people, the ones who understood the secrets carried in the mountains. She told him how she'd learned to read and write from Jesuit missionaries before they were driven from the land. She told him about her dream, a people living without the constant fear that a forged piece of paper could erase their right to exist. Mateo listened with something close to devotion. Every detail pulled him further toward her, each word another thread tying him back to life. It wasn't only her striking beauty, it was her unbroken spirit that held him. They reached her small adobe house on the edge of town, a refuge from the cruelty of the world. The garden held desert plants defying the dryness with bursts of color. "This is where I kept the original documents," she said, "buried under the floor of the house where I was born." Inside, the house was humble but filled with a peace Mateo had never known, the smell of dried herbs, fresh ground corn, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. They spent the night talking, mapping out every detail of the trial that would change the region forever. Mateo realized Nayeli was so much more than a woman who had survived injustice. She was a brilliant strategist who understood that knowledge was the sharpest weapon against tyranny. She had names, dates, exact amounts of every bribe Rodrigo had ever paid. "You're a dangerous woman," Mateo said, the first real smile crossing his face in years. "Only when someone tries to take what I love and what's rightfully mine," she replied, chin raised. That night brought little rest. While Nayeli organized her evidence and Mateo checked every entrance to the house, word arrived that several of Rodrigo's men were still loose. If they waited too long, the documents could vanish and the witnesses could be silenced for good, so they decided to leave at first light. By morning, San Judas was alive with a kind of energy the town hadn't felt in years. A group of volunteer townspeople, armed with tools and resolve, prepared to make the journey. Mateo rode beside Nayeli, his dark silhouette cutting against the light of dawn. The road to Chihuahua was long, dangerous, full of natural and human traps alike. Bandits waited in the canyons, and the weather could turn from furnace to freezer in a matter of hours. Still, they rode forward with an unshakable confidence, shielded by the weight of their purpose. On the second day, a violent sandstorm swallowed the sun by midday. The wind howled with a force that threatened to knock the horses off their feet and blind every rider. They took shelter beneath an ancient rock formation while the world outside disappeared under a wall of sand. Mateo wrapped his heavy poncho around Nayeli, sharing what warmth and protection he had. In that shelter, with the wind battering the rocks outside, Mateo finally told her the truth. He had been a captain in the Spanish cavalry who refused to fire on unarmed farmers. From the day of that refusal, he had lived as a man on the run, his honor intact, but his life in ruins. Nayeli said nothing at first. She didn't try to absolve him, and she didn't call him a hero. "I can't change what you did before," she finally said, "but I can see what you chose to do today." Mateo lowered his eyes. No one had ever offered him anything close to forgiveness, and maybe that was exactly why those words meant so much. When the storm began to ease, Nayeli rested her hand briefly over his. It wasn't a promise of love. It was the quiet recognition of two people learning to trust each other. They reached Chihuahua 3 days later, exhausted but resolute. The trial was neither quick nor easy. Rodrigo's allies tried to discredit Nayeli, buy off witnesses, and make evidence disappear, but she had prepared for exactly that. Copies of every document, every date, every name. The people of San Judas, who had once stared into their drinks instead of speaking up, testified one after another. Weeks later, Rodrigo was found guilty of forgery, land theft, and corruption. He lost every acre he had taken illegally and was sentenced for his crimes. The stolen lands were returned to the families and communities who could prove their rightful claim. Nayeli's name became a symbol of justice and courage across the entire province. Mateo stayed by her side, not as a bodyguard, but as a partner in life. He was no longer the drifting stranger looking for a way to forget his past. He had become the man protecting a home he never thought he'd have, standing beside the woman who had given him his soul back. In time, Nayeli and Mateo built a simple house on the land she had fought so hard to reclaim. He no longer rode to escape anything. Now he rode to protect something. She kept defending the families of the region with documents, memory, and a will that no landowner could ever break again. Some evenings they sat outside and watched the sun disappear into the desert, saying nothing about fate or legend, needing only the quiet certainty that, for the first time, neither of them was alone. Maybe real freedom was never about riding without direction. Maybe it was about finding a place worth staying for, and worth fighting for. In San Judas, no one ever called Mateo a stranger again. But whenever the story was told, his name never stood alone, because it was Nayeli's intelligence, one repentant man's courage, and a whole town's long overdue decision to stop looking away that changed the fate of that valley forever. The desert never forgot that day, and neither did the people who finally understood that injustice only ever wins while everyone else stays silent. If this story pulled you in, there are more like it waiting for you. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.